Well, you mentioned Churchill a minute ago, and of course it was one of Churchill's cherished projects to write a history of the English-speaking peoples. It would probably get you at least disinvited from most major campuses. It's become quite hard to write about the history of the British Empire without being subjected to vilification. So there has been a pretty successful effort on the intellectual left to delegitimize the study of British and indeed European expansion. Now, for me, this has always seemed strange because it's clear that one of the most important historical phenomena of the half millennium after around 1500 was the emigration of Europeans and their settlement all over the world, from North America to Australasia. And that's such an interesting phenomenon, we need to study it in all its complexity. And I've written a couple of books that deal with this issue, Empire and Civilization, books that take very seriously and document the bad things that Europeans did when they settled in other countries, the effects that their settlement had, both unintended and intended, on native populations. That's something that's not in any way whitewashed in my writing. But I also show that this process of expansion transformed the world in positive ways too. And a great deal of what we take for granted as the modern world today is a consequence of that period of European settlement. And Australia today is a very clear example of what happens when you transplant a civilization and you essentially establish it in a completely new setting. I don't think it would be possible to argue that this has been a net failure, a net disaster. There has been all kinds of ugliness along the way, but on balance, it seems to me clear that the benefits have outweighed the costs. Same goes for North America. Certainly, slavery remains a blot on the history of the United States of America. But that is not the only thing we should discuss when we're talking about the history of the most successful economy, and it could be argued the most successful democracy in history. The difficulty we have is that a subtle weighing of costs and benefits is not regarded as legitimate by people on the left, who will simply demonize you for talking about those benefits and insist that we must only talk about the costs. I was very struck by the fact that after the publication of Empire, which is now nearly 15 years ago, there really wasn't a reasoned debate in Britain. There was a sustained attack, often I thought by people who hadn't read the book, implying that the book was an apologia for imperialism, which it's not. It's a historical attempt to understand the phenomenon in both its good and bad respects. I found it very depressing that we couldn't have a serious debate about the costs and benefits of empire, and it turns out we still can't. An article was published recently in a scholarly journal by a young North American academic asking precisely this question. Rather to my mortification, he didn't cite my work, but that's okay. But he was more or less flayed alive for having written this. So we've essentially arrived at a situation in which we can't discuss this subject. And therefore, gradually it is accepted that it must all have been bad, and therefore we must all feel in some measure alienated from our roots, from Australia's roots, for that matter, from the roots of North America's societies. And that leads, I think, in turn, to this slightly exaggerated exaltation of other cultures and civilizations, and systematic denigration of anything that really could be associated with British or European expansion. It's a bizarre distortion of historical reality, but as an ideological achievement, you have to hand it to the left. They really have achieved their goal, which was to delegitimize the consequences of European expansion and to make people descended from European settlers feel ashamed of their roots.